Hi, and thanks for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. At the Path 11 podcast, we are here trying to deliver leading-edge research on consciousness, healing, and metaphysics. And just like you, we are trying to answer the big questions about life. Who are we? Why are we here? And what is our purpose? We hope by listening to our podcast, it will make each day you live on Earth a little easier to understand. And now for today's podcast. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Path 11 podcast. I am so excited to bring this episode to you today. We've actually been doing an induced after-death communication series since I got trained in this protocol as a therapist back in 2024. And our guest today is someone who's truly reshaping the way we understand grief and the afterlife. And this is episode number 4 in this series. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Tom Nehmy, a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience and a groundbreaking passion for healing grief through induced after-death communication. After his own spontaneous after-death communications, Tom became a visiting research fellow at the University of Adelaide, where his controlled evaluations of IADC are changing lives and science as we know it. He has a new book coming out March 1st, and so this podcast should be out there right around the time that it is coming out. And the title of this book is Inspired Life, Beautiful Death: Healing Grief, Overcoming Fear of Death, and Living a Spiritual Life. A powerful journey from therapist to healer, offering hope for those navigating loss. With a mission to make this extraordinary therapy accessible to anyone, anywhere. Tom's virtual practice brings comfort and connection right into people's homes. And let's not forget, this award-winning scholar has shared his wisdom with over 50,000 people worldwide through workshops and keynotes. And you guys can bet I am going to try and get Tom as a keynote speaker at one of my grief retreats someday soon. So get ready for this deep and inspiring conversation. This is one that you are not going to want to miss. We're going to hear about how when he was 8 years old, he was asking his grandmother about death, how he came to know his own intuition and was able to kind of feel things and predict things and follow that and develop that. We're also going to hear about his own after-death communication experiences that he has had with deceased loved ones. We're going to try and get into induced after-death communication and the research. This man has done research. Thank you. So all of you IADC therapists out there, this is going to be an awesome podcast for you as well, because we're going to talk about his research and what he's been doing. And then if we get to it, there's this beautiful thing that he has kind of created called the Day Review, all inspired about near-death experiences and how we can begin to live every single day very consciously and with intention. So, Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, April. It's wonderful to be with you.
I don't even know where we're going to begin.
There's so much to talk about, isn't there?
To talk about. I'm just really, really honored to have you on this podcast. And it was really great reading your book, as we have some shared scholars, that we follow, that we admire. We both have the same teacher in IADC. So for your listeners, you're going to hear me use and Tom use IADC. Again, I just want to remind you, it means induced after-death communication. It's a type of therapy. And so we have a lot to get through. So let's start how we normally start in most podcasts, because some of my listeners are going to be new to you and have no idea who you are and a little bit of a background of your story. I know that you love to race cars, and you thought you were going to be a race car driver someday. So from fast cars to becoming a therapist to becoming a researcher on after death, let's let our audience know a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, April, my upbringing, I think, was reasonably normal. Probably the only thing that stands out, having grown up in Adelaide, South Australia, is that I'm a triplet. So I have 2 brothers the same age as me. That's, I guess, a little unusual. It's normal for me, but people are often fascinated by that. And growing up, I just wanted to race cars. That's all I was interested in. And it's funny, the path to psychology and grief therapist was a roundabout one. because I made a deal with my parents after I finished high school. I said, look, I'm not really interested in studying at university. I just want to race cars. And they said, well, they had a healthy skepticism about this ambition. And they said, well, we'll make a deal. Take a year after high school, go as hard as you can, see what you can do. But if you're not really, it doesn't look like it's going to happen, we think you should go to university. So this was the deal. And yeah, I guess unfortunately for me at the time, I was pretty devastated. My ambitions didn't come to fruition. And so plan B was to become a psychologist. And eventually that involved learning a bit about research and working with clients, dealing in preventing psychological disorders. And really where I'm at now is, I think, entering into a third phase of my career where it's really a lot to do with healing grief. And yeah, it's been a bit of a roundabout journey, but I feel deeply that this is a part of my path. It's part of what I'm supposed to be doing. So there's a lot of peace with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, when I was reading your book, it really touched me as a therapist. Like the first 3 or 4 pages just hooked me in, because when we're talking about sitting across from clients who are grieving, sometimes if you're not grief informed, and if you don't have a therapy like induced after death communication or, EMDR or things of that, you could feel like, how am I really going to help this person but just sit and hold space for them, and you can feel really helpless. I mean, you hooked me in right there. I was like, oh yes, he is just really talking about the depths of how painful it can be as clinicians to sit with that sadness and feel helpless.
I did. I would feel so helpless when I had grieving clients, and anything else, I felt like I had tools that I could use to help. If someone comes and they've got anxiety or depression, you say, well, okay, we've got these tools and we can kind of fix things. We can probably help you. When people came to me and they were in deep distress over somebody dying, I certainly didn't feel at all that I could help them in any substantive way. I would sit with them. I was willing to help them where I could. We could talk about ways of coping with distress and getting support, all the fundamental things that you think a therapist might do. But there was this real deep frustration and helplessness because I knew I didn't have a tool that would really help with that deep sadness. And I guess I became a little bit averse to working with grieving people. It's not like I was turning people away, but it's definitely not something that I sought out in my clinic, because I just had that helplessness. So when IADC therapy came along, it changed everything, because I never would have imagined that a single therapy in 2 90-minute sessions, which is the standard protocol, could so greatly reduce somebody's sadness and distress. And so I've done a 180-degree turn from feeling helpless in working with grieving people to absolutely believing that I can help them.
Yes, I agree with you as well. And we're going to get into a little bit of your backstory, but there was something that I had quoted in your book too that was kind of like, once you stumble upon this type of resource for people, you can kind of get addicted to it. Like when you're like, now I'm seeking out people who are grieving, because when you really see the change, the life change for a person, shift with this therapy, you just want to find as many grieving people and say, hey, let's try this, So I was kind of laughing. I love your sense of humor too, in the book about like, I know that feeling, because after I got trained and, did sessions and I had a personal experience with it, I just felt like there's nothing else that I want to be doing. And my colleague and I, we have like hit the ground running, trying to educate people about this. We're running grief retreats for people, like an intensive grief retreat using the IADC therapy. So I share this passion with you because it just touches me to see how people can really heal that core sadness and no longer have to associate the sadness with the death of their loved one, but they can move more into that continuing bond with them.
Yes. And this, it's so powerful. And Dr. Alan Botkin, the founder of this method, he says himself, one of the biggest problems with IADC therapy and getting it out there is that it seems too good to be true.
Yeah, right.
People almost can't grasp what it can do. And we don't need to exaggerate it. We don't need to be hyperbolic here, because it is in and of itself an amazing therapy. And the rate of therapeutic effect is unlike any other therapy I've worked with before. And so it is addictive, because what a rush, what an amazing feeling to, contribute to that healing in someone. And you'll see in the space of 2 consecutive days, somebody go from intense distress. They might say, I'm 10 out of 10 in terms of how sad I feel, to go to saying I'm 0 out of 10, or I feel surrounded by love, or I feel this incredible warmth, or I feel so calm and so peaceful. You just would never, ever expect as a therapist to see that level of clinical change in the space of 2 sessions. It's just unheard of. And yet in IADC, it's normal. We expect that, right?
Right. Yeah. And, what it reminds me, I guess, of the whole reason, and Tom, you might agree with this, like why we became therapists is because we really wanted to help people and feel like we are able to facilitate change in their lives. And this IADC experience for me as a therapist feels like, oh, I am really helping to facilitate this. Like, this is why I became a therapist. This is why I wanted to do this. Do you kind of get that same feeling too?
Totally. Therapists want to heal. This is what floats a therapist's boat, is that if you can really help someone, that's why we're doing it. And so it's incredibly empowering from the therapist side of it to have this incredible tool. And in terms of having an impact on people's lives, it is life-changing. And in fact, that specific phraseology, it's life-changing, it's changed my life, or I got my life back. This is really verbatim the kind of feedback that we get from clients, and from some of the client case studies that I've put in the book. They're literally saying that. And I've had people say, I used to wake up and think, I can't believe I'm still here. I don't want to be here. I'm so grief-stricken. To then getting out of bed saying, great, what am I going to do today? And completely re-engaging in life. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? It really is.
It sure is. It sure is. And we're definitely going to get to the research and the inspiration behind your new book. But I would love for us to go and talk about your Nana, who was a mental health nurse and your best friend. And the way that you wrote about her was so just endearing and sweet. And I really felt like her personality and true essence came through with every single word that you wrote about her. I could feel her in this book. She was like your best friend, as you said, 8-year-old boys, young boys usually want to go hang out with friends, but your Nana was your best friend and such a positive influence in your life. And a lot kind of, your relationship with her kind of leads into a little bit of very early on, before you even knew it, that maybe you were going to be doing this work and, asking questions at a very young age, asking her about this, and then also leading to some experiences with after-death communication with her. So I'd love for you to share the beauty of her with my audience and give us a little more backstory about that.
Sure. Well, my Nana, she was just the most special person to me. And yeah, she was my best friend when I was a kid. So if you can imagine, people throw around this term unconditional love, but I think in my life, Nana was the best representation of unconditional love, because it didn't really matter what I did or how I behaved. She just loved me. And it was a very one-sided relationship. When I was young, it was, because she was just this adoring, loving, caring presence. And, home life was really busy. As I said, I'm a triplet. And so for me, whenever I wanted to escape, I would go and stay with Nana. And it turned out that I would often spend, 1 or 2 nights a week at her house, being fussed over, what do you want to eat, Tommy? What do you want for dinner? Dad, do you want some ice cream? I'll make you hot chocolate. And this was really it was just so loving. I was just completely spoiled. And so Nana became kind of my confidant. She was my confederate when I was, sometimes when you're a kid, you feel a little bit sick, but you exaggerate it to stay home from school. And then Nan would take me wherever I wanted to go. So we'd go and have a day out, right? And she'd always kind of, keep it hush hush. So it was kind of natural that when I wanted to talk to her about death when I was 8 years old, and it was the first time I think that it occurred to me that, okay, Nana would one day die. I would one day die. In fact, this death thing is going to happen to everyone. And it was kind of distressing to me as an 8-year-old. I couldn't imagine, like, what is that? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to her? And so one day she was doing some laundry. I remember this vividly. She was putting some washing into the washing machine in laundry. And I said to her, Nana, what happens when we die? And she kind of got this look on her face like, oh, okay, this is kind of an important question. But she didn't want to alarm me. She was a pretty matter-of-fact person. She just turned back to putting the clothes in the washing machine. And she said, oh, it's just like going to sleep. You just don't wake up. And I think this was her well-intentioned way of alleviating my fear and saying, well, it's just like going to sleep. There's nothing to worry about. But that didn't alleviate my fear at all. And I said, well, what would that be like to go to sleep and not wake up? Like, it almost just fed into this fear that I grappled with for quite a long time. But as Nana got older, the relationship was less one way. And I ended up, when I got my driver's license, I would go and check on her, and I would visit her in her house and sometimes bring her meals. And we were still so very close. But then I realized that I had this connection with Nana, born out of love and empathy and some kind of spiritual connection, I suppose, where I just got a sense when she needed me, or I got a sense when I thought something was not quite right with her. And in particular, I recall one day I was driving along coming back from university where I was studying my undergraduate degree in psychology. And I had this very strong feeling that I needed to go to Nana. I can't explain it. It's a strange sort of feeling, just like a sense of urgency. And so I raced there in my car, and I got in the door, and she seemed fine. I thought, why did I have this strange feeling? And I got into the house, sat on the couch and started chatting to her as we normally would. And then I smelt gas, and I realized she had left. She was getting older, and she was just not managing things as well as she used to. And she'd put on 1 or 2 gas burners on full bore on her stove, but hadn't lit them. And when I'd been sitting on the couch for about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I thought, oh my gosh, I was able to take her outside and open the windows. But if I hadn't had that feeling, hadn't gone to her, I don't know, it could have ended very differently. So I started to sense that there was more to my connection with Nana than meets the eye. It was a surprising intuition, I guess.
Right. And so do you want to fast forward a little bit when maybe that kind of continued to strengthen as she was getting older, coming closer to making her transition here, out of the physical body, and you just kind of having that sense and knowing that, and maybe that you could then bring us into one, if you'd like, because I don't want to give your whole book away, but maybe one of the after-death communications that you had with her.
Sure. And I have to say, for all of your listeners, that I don't consider myself to be a gifted, intuitive person. I think I'm a kind of regular guy, but it was just that occasionally these things would happen, and it seemed often to be tied to Nana. So that happened a few times where I would just out of the blue, I would get this feeling. And one in particular was as she was getting older and she was in the nursing home, I didn't want to think about it, but I knew it was getting close to the end and that she would die. And one day I was at home. I think by this stage I was doing my postgraduate studies, or maybe I was just started working as a psychologist. And I had this feeling again, it came out of nowhere, and it was quite intense. She had been unwell, but I didn't want to think that this was going to be the end. I was trying to juggle, this busy new professional life that I had. And I'd kind of resolved that I would visit her soon, but I then kind of pushed it out of my mind. I wasn't sure when I was going to go to the nursing home, but I was out like a bolt out of the blue. I was at home, and I had this incredibly strong feeling, even stronger than before, that I needed to go to Nana. But do you think I could find my keys?
Yep.
And I don't lose my keys. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not, my keys are just sitting where they always do. And I couldn't find them. And I was running around the house and this feeling was just growing inside of me. And I was becoming more and more panicked. Anyway, it took me about 5 minutes to find the keys to my car. I raced over to the nursing home. I kind of burst in and went straight to her room. And as I got in the door, I saw my father crying. And Nana had just died, 1 minute before.
Mm.
So all of these things were not just reflective of this very special connection I had with Nana, but that there is a spiritual reality. There's something beyond what we can just feel and touch. There is something there. And, after Nana died, I didn't beat myself up over that. I really think maybe that moment was meant for Dad and Nana. So I kind of was mourning her, but I didn't feel regretful because she had a full life. I couldn't complain about that. She was 84, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I missed her, but I realized she had got to the end of her natural life and I accepted it. But I always thought to myself, April, if there is such a thing as life after death, if ever there is, someone would come and visit me to let me know that they're okay, it was going to be Nana. And the months went by and there was nothing. And I thought, what does this mean? I was a bit concerned and just missing her, I suppose. Eventually, I think it must have been about 18 months after she had passed. One morning, I was coming out of sleep. It definitely wasn't a dream, but I saw her. She was about 60 years old, so looks nearly 25 years younger than when she died. I saw her she was right in front of me, three-dimensional, looking at high-definition TV, perfectly clear image of her. I could feel her presence and she was just smiling at me. And I had this incredible feeling of love come over me, this great reassurance. And it was only when it only lasted a few seconds, but I don't think I said this out loud, but kind of mentally said to her, "Nan, you look great. You look really well." And she didn't say anything back. She was just smiling at me. And when this experience ended and I kind of put down my face and all over the pillow, but she did come to me. And this was my first after-death communication. And it was so reassuring, so comforting, such a healing experience. And it was a really, really special thing. So, I felt Nana's presence at other points in my life following that. And it was just a special continuation of this remarkable relationship. But it was really good evidence to me that there is life after death. It isn't that you just go to sleep and don't wake up. And she was still with me in some way. And, that was incredibly comforting.
Yeah. And it's like those experiences, when you have that experience, like before she came, like maybe you really did question that, and maybe there really isn't, if anyone would visit me, it would be her. And I think, when those of us have had experiences of after-death communication, dream visitations, kind of those synchronicities that happen, it's really hard to convince you otherwise that, nope, we just die and that's it. There's nothing continues.
Yeah. It's implausible then, isn't it? Once
Right.
You've had those experiences. Yeah, definitely. And, this is really common. So I don't think people realize how common ADCs are.
Right.
Really, it's at least the lowest estimate is that about 30% of people, like if you're just walking down the street and tapping people on the shoulder and asking them, have you ever felt the presence of a deceased person? 1 in 3 would say yes. And the research suggests that overwhelmingly, these are really positive, healing, helpful experiences for people to have. So it's out there, but I just think people don't talk about it. It's really the last taboo, isn't it? Death and dying.
Right. Absolutely. And I love that you cited Bill and Judy Guggenheim's work as well. For those of you who are listening, that's something that you want to take a look at. It's an older research study that they did, Hello from Heaven. And they were really the ones that coined after-death communication. And, I think some people are a little scared to talk about it, even if they have these experiences. So, when the research shows 1 in 3, It might even be a little bit more, but, is this normal to talk about, that I felt a presence, that I saw my grandmother who was dead, as I was waking up? So like some people feel a little like, am I going to be judged for this? Or are people going to think I'm crazy?
It's kind of a vulnerable thing, isn't it? Like, I mean, if you were at a dinner party or out with friends, it's not necessarily the topic that would come up. But I also understand that it's quite vulnerable sharing it because it's such a personal thing. It's such a meaningful, comforting experience. And if you put it out there only for someone to dismiss it or invalidate it or, God forbid, ridicule you over it, that's pretty painful then for people. So I think there's a part of people wanting to treasure these very personal things and not be too vulnerable with it.
Right. But one thing that I love about you and the work that you're doing and the research and this book that you have put together is that we're starting to make death a conversation. We're putting words to it. We're making it, be normal. I'm always so shocked, that sometimes people don't want to talk about it or admit that it's ever going to happen to them. But yet it's the one thing that we know we all have in common. None of us are getting out of here alive. Like, it is, you are human, you are born, and you will die. So we have to start embracing this, not fear it. And, the better we have a relationship with death, I think the better we live. And you kind of alluded to some of that towards the end of your book too.
Absolutely. And, any therapist will tell you the most prevalent unhelpful coping strategy is avoidance. And so it's like collectively as a species, we're engaging this mass avoidance of the inevitable. We don't want to think about death. We don't want to talk about it, but it's absolutely 100% going to happen to everybody. So why aren't we more curious about this? I think people feel uncomfortable about it. It's the unknown to them. There's a lot of these perhaps misconceptions, or people catastrophize what it all means depending on their belief system. So they avoid it. But I think we need to talk about it. And, ADCs and IADC therapy, I think the more conversations we have, people are going to find comfort in that. And as you know, there's actually mounting scientific evidence to say that we don't cease to exist when we die.
Right. And that's why this podcast and conversation that we're having right now is so important. And I'm so excited about it. All right, let me get back to some of my notes. And I just want you to know there's so much that I want to talk to you about. So if I skip over a few things, it's just really based on time. And so I might fast forward us a little bit to, let's see, why don't we go to how you met our trainer, Cesar Valdez. Is that, I pronounce his last name? I'm always pronouncing his name wrong, but... So why don't you kind of bring us to how, you had been trained in EMDR, you were trying to find tools as a therapist, and it was around COVID time, I think, when you kind of stumbled around the IADC therapy when you got trained, 2021. Am I right?
Yeah. So yeah. I was trained by Cesar Valdez in early 2022 and kind of then went off all guns blazing, as you know. But it was that I'd read Alan Botkin's book and I loved it. I was fascinated. My first thought was it sounds too good to be true, but I was intrigued. And then, life gets in the way. COVID happened and I had a very busy professional life. So I was really concerned about how am I going to fit this in? But somewhere in the back of my mind, I felt strongly that this was something I should do and wanted to do. So when COVID hit, I thought, well, that really is going to put the brakes on things. I believed that I would need to travel to the States in order to be trained with Dr. Botkin. I hadn't at that stage, I wasn't aware that you could get trained online. And so I'd done my EMDR training for the sole purpose of eventually doing my IADC training, and then COVID hit. But when the movie Life with Ghosts came out, I saw an email saying there's this movie and it relates to Dr. Alan Botkin and IADC, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to see this. I think it was 2 days before Christmas when I learned about this, and it was very late one night, kind of, like the night before Christmas Eve, and I was sitting in the dark by myself watching this incredible documentary about death and grief and following some widows around, but in particular, this study into IADC therapy. And it was like it pushed a button in me. So I thought, no, I can't put this off any longer. This is what I must be doing. Have you ever had that feeling in life where you just feel compelled? And so that night, before I went to bed, I sent an email to Dr. Alan Botkin, and said, okay, I'd like to be trained. And he wrote back. I saw that his reply the next morning. He said he was retired. And my first thought was, oh no. And then he said, but you can do your IADC training online with Cesar Valdez. And so I booked straight in. It was only a couple of months later I was able to get into a training session, and then I was off and away. And it's been an amazing experience ever since.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you went through your training, did you connect with your Nana at all? Or did you have somebody specifically in mind? Or, would you like to talk at all about your personal IADC session?
So I didn't have an IADC session as part of the training, but we watched a video of an IADC session. And I think maybe that's partly a function of everyone being online or the size of the group or whatever. But I had initially started experimenting actually with my wife. And this bit is not in the book, but I was just trying to figure it out, get my head around it. And eventually I did quite a bit of pro bono work just to get experience and learn more about it. But my wife's grandmother had died, and they had a pretty fractious relationship. She would often say, yeah, grandma, she could be not very nice, and they didn't always get along. But of course, she loved her grandparents and was very much a caring, dutiful granddaughter. But after her grandma died, I thought, oh, look, can we just try? Like, she had these mixed feelings about the death. And so I did some bilateral stimulation, some eye movement, kind of just generally going through the protocol. And my wife was surprised how much sadness there was. She was crying quite a lot. We went through a number of sets. And as we noticed with clients, the intensity increases, but then it decreases. And she started feeling calm and very peaceful. There was this quite quick movement into that. And I then thought, well, nothing's really happening here. There doesn't seem to be an ADC occurring, and sometimes it doesn't, and that's fine. It was still definitely healing her sadness. But I thought I'll just switch from eye movement to tapping, and I had my wife place her hands on her knees, and I was tapping her hands alternately. And after a couple of sets, she started crying again. And this is where because I was inexperienced, I had a thought of, oh, does this mean more sadness is coming up? But it wasn't that. She said to me, no, these are happy tears, and I feel surrounded by love. And so she was crying these intense emotional tears, but it was this incredible positive emotion. And I said, can you see grandma? And she said, I can't see grandma. But I said, where do you think the feeling's coming from? Is the feeling coming from grandma? And she said, yes, it definitely is. So this being enveloped by love, warmth, an incredible presence, this is part of what clients report. And that was one of my first experiences actually administering the protocol, and amazing. It worked right away.
Yeah. And in your book, you give a lot of case examples of people that you have worked with. And so this book isn't just for people who are curious about IADC, but I also feel like I'm so appreciative of it as a IADC therapist. It's almost like reading some case consultations and seeing what you did and, hearing the stories as well. So I think all of the IADC therapists that are being trained right now, this is like a must-have on your bookshelf to refer back to. And I wanted to talk about two of the stories, but let me just get to a couple more of my notes here because, all right, let's see here. Hold on. I told you I've got a lot of notes. All right, we've covered Nana here. All right, well maybe we can talk about a little bit about the protocol and how it can be a little intimidating and scary, but when people maybe are contemplating this therapy, they're going to hear us on these podcasts saying, like, we are going after that sadness. We do the worst first, and it's much different than typical eye movement therapy. Because with all the work that Botkin has done in it with his thousands of sessions that he had, realize that really the root is the sadness. And if we can clear that sadness, then everything else kind of like falls into place. And that can somewhat be a little bit intimidating for people. But you did a really great job in the book, I think, to have people not be so scared about that. And I would love, love, love for you to talk to the importance about why it is so crucial as part of the journey in healing and shifting this grief, that identifying and going after your core sadness is really the biggest part of it all.
Yeah, it is. And this is why IADC works and why it's, I think, the most effective thing we can probably do for most people. Because as Dr. Botkin said, grief, the core of grief is sadness. So you might have some anger, you might have some guilt, you might have some fear. He calls these kind of secondary emotions, but at the core, at the heart of it, is sadness. And that's why initially he actually called his approach core-focused EMDR, because he said sadness is at the core and we need to go to the core. And if you reduce that core sadness, then the other things resolve naturally. So it can be quite intimidating, both for the client and the therapist, to directly step into the most intense parts of their experience. So we really need to have clients be willing to tolerate very high levels of emotion. It's possibly nothing they haven't experienced in their day-to-day life, but of course in daily life, we manage our emotions. When we go to work, when we go to the shops, when we do all these different things, we're always managing ourselves. So somebody in deep grief will put on the brave face to go to the shops or go to work. And this becomes kind of habitual. It becomes a coping strategy. But the sadness is still there. And when we go into IADC therapy, we need them to not manage it, but to step into it. And in a way, I've heard this therapy described as almost being an aggressive therapy, because we're directing people, we're really insisting that they step into the most distressing part of their experience.
Right.
That's how it's going to work. And so we repeatedly take them in to the worst part of their sadness. Now, that sounds very full on and a bit scary, but it's the way the therapy works. If we don't go into the sadness, if we try to manage it or just in any way block it, it's going to stop the therapy from working. So the way it works is we access that emotion fully. IADC is an emotion-focused therapy. And while people are experiencing that intense sadness, while they're feeling it, we apply this bilateral stimulation through eye movement or through tapping, let's say. And that is switching on the brain's natural healing power. And very quickly, it changes in the brain. So both the client and the therapist have to be willing to step into pretty intense emotions. It's not everybody's cup of tea. And of course, we have screening procedures to make sure that, we're only doing this therapy with people who are well equipped to handle it and likely to benefit from it. But it is the intensity, it is the directness that makes it work and makes it work so quickly.
Right. Yeah. And, I think in the stories that you shared of your case studies and case examples about that even though your clients kind of experience that, the depths of their sadness, it also, there's always, after there's that peak, there's like this openness. And it's almost like, I think you had said in the book, like when you're going through that dark tunnel, and this might have been Botkin's metaphor and reference, that when you're driving through a dark tunnel and you get scared, you don't stay in the center of the tunnel. You want to get out. And when you get out and you get to the light, it's kind of what I've seen happen with my clients too, is after that peaks, the core sadness, and we work through it and they're clearing it, that all of a sudden, like, memories of beautiful times with their loved one can start to come in, or there's that feeling of peace that you're talking about, or this feeling of love. And this is something, that you've documented in your book too, that you've seen on a regular basis as well.
Yeah. And when IADC therapists are beginning their work, they need to trust the process, because maybe, I don't know if you had this experience, but certainly with some of my early clients, it'd be getting pretty intense. Like, people are really feeling their sadness. They're quite distressed. And you'd have this thought, gee, I hope this looks like, I hope we're going to get to the other side. But of course it does. And it always does when you follow the protocol. And so if you can just get people, and this is why we also need to gain that commitment from the clients. Like, we don't stop. We don't want to start this, unlock this emotion, have someone feel distressed and then stop. We definitely don't want that. And we want to prime our clients to say, we just have to keep going. So we give them that hope and that promise that it's going to feel better, and it does. We just have to go through. Keep your foot on the gas, we say, get to the other end. And eventually you do get to that light at the other end, which is the feeling of peace, calm. It's like clockwork, those specific words. People are often quite spontaneously saying, oh, all of a sudden I feel incredibly peaceful. I feel calm. Or sometimes they'll say, it feels like the sadness is gone. Sometimes people will say, oh, I was blocking it. And I'll say to them, well, were you blocking it? Were you trying to suppress your sadness? And they'll say no. But it's the only way that they can explain to themselves that the sadness has gone so quickly.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I have a quote here that I've been looking for. It's really hard to highlight a PDF. Usually I have a physical book, but I know it's not printed yet. So I'm trying to go off of a PDF here. But I want to go back to why maybe focusing on sadness and not trying to control it in these sessions can be so hard. And you said it beautifully. You said avoidance, suppression, and regulation are essential tools that allow a grieving person to simply keep going. So when we experience the grieving process, in order to function day to day, in order to get your kids ready for school, in order to go to work and function, we avoid, suppress, and regulate. And when you come into an IADC session, we're saying, don't do any of that. Just find it, let it come up. It doesn't matter how ugly it looks. It doesn't matter how many tissues you have. I think it was Carolyn, one of your clients, she got a little analytical sometimes, but, you just kind of kept reassuring her, just let it flow. And I thought that was so perfect, the way that you described how we're so used to handling and regulating our grief.
Yes. And so I think we need to say to our clients, we're going to do something different today. We're not going to manage it. We're not going to hold it back. And it doesn't matter if you're ugly crying. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about your impression that you're giving me. I'll say that quite explicitly to clients. Don't worry about how I feel about how you're going. Don't worry about how you're coming across. I've seen it all before. It's more important that you just let yourself feel it and go with it. So we have to explicitly give clients permission to go into that state of fully feeling it, because it's absolutely critical and it's not what they're used to. So that part of it's quite important.
Yeah. And it's beautiful, because when are we ever really given permission to just fully let that go? Where is that space where we don't ever have to contain it?
Well, it's so refreshing for clients, because this is the difference with ordinary counseling. And I don't want to be too disparaging of other approaches, but, so often in therapy, we're helping somebody manage their symptoms. We're helping them manage their feelings. How can you do to, cope with this or that? But we're not always able to directly go towards the root cause. In IADC, it's so direct, and that's refreshing for people. I've had people who've been in grief counseling for months and months. They've tried lots of things, and they'll say, what was so refreshing about IADC is we fully feel it. You go directly into the sadness, and you give me space to fully feel it and let the healing occur. Whereas too often we're skirting around it. We're trying, clients are trying not to appear too distressed. They subconsciously don't want to be burdensome to their therapist. Therapists want to feel like they're making progress, and they don't sometimes want to see too much distress. So there's this dance of skirting around it. Whereas IADC is direct. We say, we're going after the worst, let yourself feel it, and we're going to keep our foot on the gas.
Right. All right. So let's keep moving and talk a little bit about your research and how you were inspired to say, all right, I need to start researching this. Because I know that you had 43 participants, right? It took you about a year to do this, and you followed how to talk about, how you decided to research this and what some of your findings were. And then I have questions for that.
Yeah, sure. The research project was really important to me, because we need to give this therapy scientific credibility. We need to help it become mainstream, because the public health opportunity here is enormous. But we can't rely on anecdote alone. We can't rely on our enthusiasm alone. We have to demonstrate that this works. Now, we all owe a debt of gratitude to Professor Jan Holden, who conducted the first controlled trial of IADC therapy at the University of North Texas. And she did a study comparing these 2 sessions of IADC therapy with 2 sessions of traditional grief counselling. And that was the first step towards putting some really solid scientific data out there to help support IADC as a clinical intervention. And I wanted to build on that. In fact, I felt, as I said, compelled, obligated. I have a moral obligation to contribute to the dissemination of this therapy because it can help so many people. So this was a project I undertook on a voluntary basis outside of my usual job. So this consumes nights and weekends for a year. And thankfully, I have a very supportive wife and, juggling that with parenting and other things. But she also recognized this is so important. So along with my colleague, John Daniels, a psychologist from Queensland in Australia, he and I saw a total of 43 clients over the course of about a year. And we did a waitlist controlled trial. So participants would have their grief and sadness effectively measured over a month-long baseline period. Many of these people had been in similar levels of grief for months and years. So we needed to take that as a baseline. That acted as the statistical control. And if grief is stable, you expect that for the participants, it's not really going to change much over that month. And that's in fact what we found. Their grief didn't change over that baseline wait period. Then we gave them the 2 IADC therapy sessions, and then we followed them up a month later. What we have in terms of our results, and this paper is not yet published, we're about to put it out for peer review. So I can't talk numbers yet, but I can tell you that the therapeutic effects we had, what we call the effect size, was significantly bigger than the effects that we see on average in 12 to 20 sessions of cognitive behavior therapy for anxiety and depression. So in terms of the brute power, the actual impact that we have clinically for people is big. It is big. And so this study we aim to publish in a very reputable mainstream international journal. It'll undergo peer review. And really what we need to do is to put this important controlled trial out there, this data, so that it can add to the body of evidence to say this is an option and it should be considered a first-line treatment option for people experiencing grief.
That is so exciting. I cannot wait for this article to come out. Not only that, but I'm starting to work with another company on continuing education. So providing continuing education credits for grief trainings and stuff. And we have in the trainings that we're doing, my colleague and I, Kelly and I, we do have IADC as one of the complementary therapies. So we're starting to spread the word, but to have those journal articles in there as well for more, continuing ed, just research for people to read. I'm so excited about that. So that's wonderful. And, I know you said earlier, I consider myself to be a regular guy, not this person that has this major intuition. But for me, this calling that you have felt, that's you following your intuition again. And I feel like that race car driver in you is speeding up this process and putting you kind of in the driver's seat to get this research done.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, April. I think you've nailed it. Yeah, I'm in Formula One mode. I think is the way to explain it. I've found this, passion and determination, and I'm channeling it in this way because you're right. I feel deep down this is part of my purpose in life, and we all should listen to that feeling because we've all got a contribution to make out there. And yeah, this is mine. So it's very rewarding.
Absolutely. All right. So there's another part here where I'd like to quote you and talk a little bit more about how sometimes when people go through this therapy, they may not have direct communication or an after-death communication with their loved one, but the sadness is really the key point. Our teacher says you get what you want or you get what you need in IADC therapy, but not always what you want, because everybody wants the big moment, and connection. But you had, again, put something so beautifully in your book. He said, only when clients were able to separate the intensity of their grief as a measure of their love for the person who died could they truly let go of those judgments. And like that separation of intensity of the grief not being a measure of their love is huge for people to understand, that it really to separate from the deep sadness. That does not mean you stop loving that person. The depths of your love doesn't, stop for that person. So, we don't have to get into the details of it because I want people to read about, your case studies in here. But you did have two women, Carolyn and, let me see. Carolyn was one of them, and Bethany. There were two women that had really extraordinary experiences of moving through their sadness. And I think just got really more of that sense of peace, kind of like your wife, had felt and love, but it wasn't a direct after-death communication. So I was hoping you can also speak with your experience to let people know, because I want people to stay, like you said, open and willing to just the process as a whole and not get over-focused on, am I going to have this after-death communication? Because there's so much more that is happening in the therapeutic value of this tool, of how it can change a person's life when they're willing to not manage their sadness and allow the depths of that to heal in this. So I was hoping you could speak to the importance of that too.
Yes, so it's kind of ironic that the primary goal of IADC therapy is not to have an ADC. The primary goal is to reduce sadness. And it's quite important that therapists downplay the importance of ADCs in that process, because if somebody goes into IADC therapy grasping at it and only wanting to pursue a communication or a sense of connection, it can get in the way. It gets in the way of the processing. People get caught up in their head. They start judging what's happening at every step of the way. And that activation of their thinking brain completely impedes the processing, because we need them to just sit with the feeling, and that's what we guide them through. So we don't want to talk up the ADC phenomena too much. They are remarkable. They are healing, but they can come in a range of different ways, and it's usually not what people expect. So sometimes people expect that it's always going to be visual. Well, sometimes an ADC is visual, intense colors, sometimes seeing images. Sometimes it's auditory. Sometimes people say, I feel like someone just touched me. I just felt a hand on my shoulder. Often an ADC can be purely an emotional feeling of the person's presence. But for people who don't report that they feel the presence of the deceased person, that's not at all to say that the therapy hasn't worked, because our primary goal is to reduce sadness. And if somebody goes from intensely distressed over their grief and loss to feeling peaceful, calm, more confident that they can move forward in their life and that they can cope, then we've won. That's been successful. And we need to prime clients to say, well, that's actually our aim. That's going to be a successful outcome. And we agree on that. And if you have an ADC, that's a cherry on top. So we love talking about the ADC phenomena because it's so interesting, but it's not really the primary outcome.
Right. And I think, the title of it kind of markets it in that way. It's almost like we need a little bit of a new title. I kind of like, connection better than communication, because, connection does give that like connection to the love, to what we are, to that consciousness of, what we were before we came in, what we are when we leave. And, I'm leading into your day review, is we want to be that when we're here too, all about that love. So yeah. So like you said it beautifully. The after-death communication, if you have it, that's the cherry on top. That's the bonus. But really, you really want to be able to feel like you can move forward in your life and just like reintegrate again and be able to remember like the beautiful stories and to cry about the beautiful stories, not to cry about the death, not to cry about how they passed or, what had happened. So thank you for sharing that too. Okay. So another quote that I have in your book that was beautiful, and I highlighted this hot pink color because that's my favorite. So he said, being comforted by the reality that dying is beautiful and the deep bonds we have for one another do not die with death. And it is possible for the sadness of grief to be overtaken by peacefulness, acceptance, and love. And that to me really speaks to what we're trying to do here, with this type of therapy. So I just wanted, if somebody's not going to buy the book, they needed to hear those words because they're so beautiful and so important. And so if there's anything you want to say about that before we move into teaching people a little bit about your day review before we end our call.
Yeah, well, I think, there's this growing body of evidence from ADCs and ADC research, near-death experiences, and some fabulous data that we've got and studies on near-death experiences. We're having these glimpses into what our existence is really all about. And there are lessons for us, we can be reassured that unlike my fears as an 8-year-old, we don't cease to exist when we die. When other people die, we know from near-death experiences, death and the process of dying is generally not distressing for them. Often they feel so good they don't want to come back. Some people who are resuscitated, they'll admit that. So we have this growing body of evidence to suggest that death isn't what people have been taught to fear, and we can feel comforted by that, by the ongoing existence of our loved ones, by what it means for us when we die. And looking at all of that changes the frame of how we see this physical existence, where we feel separate, we're not connected to peace and love 24/7, and we have these very human challenges in this earthly world. So we can learn from those insights, from all of that evidence, and it informs, I think, what really matters when we're living in this physical life.
Right. And you have a little life hack that you put in this book for people to try to stay in the presence of the feeling of things being loving and kind and not getting too wrapped up in the mundane. And you kind of attributed it to what a lot of NDEers and near-death experience, that's what NDEers stand for if you're hearing that term for the first time, experience is what's called a life review. When they have this near-death experience, they're kind of shown all the things, the encyclopedia of every single choice, right? In your book, you're like, kind of freaks me out. We're being recorded, like every single thing is being recorded. And it reminds me of the movie with Jim Carrey of Bruce Almighty, when I don't know if you ever saw that movie, but the filing cabinet of his life like juts out and it just like takes him for like a mile back. That's a very cool movie that really talks about the afterlife if you've never seen it in a very fun, comical way. But, and you gave this really beautiful example of this man, Muhammad, who I believed had a near-death experience, and he was shown that at one point he had to go and carry like these buckets of water. And when he went to get the buckets of water and filled them, he realized that it was way too heavy for him to carry back to his family. So in order to dump the water out, he found a tree and brought the water over to the tree to give the water to the tree. And when he was shown this in his life review, that spirit was like clapping and applauding him. And he was feeling like, oh, I thought I did so many other great things in life, but like this one little act of loving kindness, to give this extra water to the tree and with intent was what was rewarded. And so you kind of talk about this process and how can we begin to like really look at our life review every single day. Watch ourselves. How are we communicating with people? If somebody really is recording this and watching this and then we have to look at it, how do you want to look at it when you die? And you kind of came up with your own practice called the day review. So I wanted to set this up for you to talk a little bit more about it because it's awesome. And I remember the first time I ever heard of the life review thing too, I was like, oh my God, I don't want to watch the first half of my life. Oh, I'm like, man, I'm screwed. But
I know I want to rewind.
Rewind, please. I could do it again. So, but when you hear that and learn about that, it really can change your life from that point on. So I love this concept of the day review and love for you to maybe finish our podcast with this really inspiring takeaway that I think if somebody's hearing it for the first time, may change the way that they are interacting with themselves, with nature, with the world, with their animals, with other people, and kind of finding more of their purpose.
Well, ever since I read that very moving little vignette of Muhammad and his life review, I've never looked at watering my garden the same way. It was just, in this world, it's not about us. It's not, our lives are not about us. This is one of the key kind of spiritual learnings and insights I've gathered, which sounds strange to say because everything in life tells us it's about us, but it's not. It's about our connection to each other and to the whole, including nature. We are part of nature. And so the near-death experiences that have been reported throughout history in so many different cultures and contexts, even starting with Dr. Raymond Moody's research in the 1970s, the life review is a really, really common feature. We can ascertain that this is likely to be something we all experience after we die. Is not just that we watch our life again, but that we feel how other people felt interacting with us. And this is the critical thing. It's what is our influence on the whole? Did we act with love or not? Did we act with selfishness? So all these things that in our physical world, in our materialist world, we judge as being a marker of success are status and job and assets and money and all of these celebrity, all these things that people think kind of they should judge their success by. None of that matters a dot. What matters is how do we influence others? Do we help them? Do we act with love? And we're all at some point going to feel our influence on other people. We're going to see it play out in our life reviews. So when I accepted this as fact, that this was likely to happen, that it is a true phenomenon, I thought, well, okay, but how do I remember that day to day? Like, it'd be very easy to say, oh, well, okay, that'll happen in a long time, when I die. But if that tells us how to live and what matters from this spiritual perspective, what really matters, how do we integrate that now? And that's why I realized it's too long to wait to the end of your life to think about your influence on others. We should be doing it every day. So I started doing the day review, which is simply getting quiet. I do it before I go to sleep at night. And you just mentally run through in your mind from when you got up that morning, all of the main interactions you had with other people before you went to bed that night. And this is truly the most transformative thing that I've done in terms of becoming a spiritual person, because it made me pause and think, how am I influencing this person? How do they feel? Is this helping them? Is this coming from a place of love, as in good intentions and goodwill and wanting the best for somebody, wanting to be a positive influence? Or what did I not do? What can I do differently? And this simple act of reviewing my day from that lens of what a life review might regard as important, it changed the way I interacted with people. It made me more patient. It made me more thoughtful. It made me think differently about what really matters in a day that's filled with competing demands and pressures. And anybody can do it. At first, it might take a little while to get into the groove of it. But eventually you find yourself thinking about your day review during the day. Right. And it makes you stop it. Hang on, I'm not going to react like that. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to think about how I say this. I'm aware of my tone of voice. I'm aware of what I'm choosing to do. And for me, this is what true spirituality is. It's not, can I sit in a lotus position and awaken my kundalini? I mean, all of that stuff is good, but it's about our influence on others. It's what we choose to do and how we live our lives. That's what being a spiritual person is. And so some of these lessons really became apparent through my research and my journey from this kind of ignorant, helpless guy who didn't want to treat grieving people to eventually having these insights of what really mattered. And I think we can all use the day review, and it certainly helped me a lot.
Absolutely. And I think anybody listening to this, you can't just unhear what Tom said. And you also said that once you start this day review, you can't, you're going to start it and you can't stop it. So none of you can unhear what Tom just said, and he'll also save you a lot of money. Like you said, you don't have to do the Kundalini yoga or have the best yoga pose or sit in meditation for an hour. Get out there and be kind, be loving. How can you make it? One of my teachers would say, make life less about you and more about others. That's exactly what you're saying as well. So beautiful. Well, we're literally running out of time, but I'm sure we will probably reach back out to you maybe once this is published and we can really talk about the numbers and talk a little more in depth about this peer-reviewed research that you have done. I would love that. And I think the other thing that's going to be really cool, Tom, is that when you and I do pass and we die, we're going to be able to probably take a look at this podcast and our interaction, and that we don't know the ripple effect right now at all, but they might be cheering us on, because maybe the work that we're doing and following our hearts around grief and death and the afterlife and doing this, hour and a half podcast here might really change people that we have no concept of until we get there. So it'll be cool to be able to review this with you, not with you, but you know what I'm saying. Like, we're both going to review this as part of our review, and we'll be like, high five. I'll high five you in the afterlife there. So
That's good.
all right, Tom. So again, this is Tom Nehmy. Why don't you take us out and let people know how they can find you, your website. You have 2 different websites, the title of your book again. I'm sure it's probably going to be available on Amazon, probably everywhere. Where are you selling it? And let people know.
Sure, people can find me at tomnehmy.com or healinggriefwithiadc.com, which is my virtual private practice. So I want to make this available to anyone, anywhere in the world, from the comfort of their own home. I want to make grief therapy accessible. So that's a huge part of what I'm doing at the moment. If people are interested in learning more and reading more about these incredible cases and the spiritual insights, my book will be out on the 1st of March. Inspired Life, Beautiful Death, and it'll be available, pretty much everywhere, I hope. So check out your online book retailers, and I hope people get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to use a little bit of my intuition. And even though you have this virtual private practice, Tom, I think you might be graduating from that, because we need you to do more research, and hopefully you can get funding for it and get paid for it. But I have a feeling that once this begins to spread, and we're going to do everything we can to spread this podcast to others and share it, and share it in our grief retreats that we're doing and stuff like that, that you're going to have a huge waiting list. People are going to be knocking on your virtual Zoom window to say, let me in, I want to come in. But we also need you to take that race car and go even faster for us, okay? Because you're leading the way for us as practitioners. Leave it to us. Please do what you're doing with your research, because I don't have the brain to do that. And so we're going to rely on you. But
thanks, April. Well, I appreciate the support very much.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to this IADC series that we have. As you guys know, I'm pretty passionate about it. And the Path 11 podcast has always been about life after death and consciousness, and do we survive it, and asking these big questions. But I'm on a kick with this, guys. So you're going to hear a lot about this. Kelly and I were running a lot of retreats, not only for people who are grieving. We are doing therapy intensives with IADC. We are holding these 3-day retreats at Silver Bay YMCA Retreat Center in upstate New York. And we're applying this protocol. And we're also, Tom, just so you know, we're adding a little bit more. We're making it more of a retreat that includes energy work with Reiki. We're doing some grief rituals with doing fire rituals. We're setting up ancestor altars of the deceased in frames and really honoring them and holding the space, and including some sound healing. It's going to be, really awesome. And then we're also offering continuing education credits and teaching a therapist how to become more grief informed, because as a therapist, this might be fascinating for you with IADC, but it's also really important to be trained in how to appropriately work with grieving clients as well. So we're providing that for continuing education credits for therapists, and we're also working with people with schools to help students who are grieving as well. So you guys can check all that information out. I'll also put that in the show notes, and Tom's title of his is going to be in there as well. We'll also throw in some information about Dr. Botkin's book, so you have more information about induced after-death communication. So thank you everyone again for listening. And as I love to sign off with a continuing bond with my mom in the afterlife, I'll remind you all to shine on. The world needs your beautiful light. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's show. If you haven't already, please subscribe and rate and review the Path 11 podcast in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, this podcast is made possible by our sponsor, Path 11 TV. Visit path11tv.com to start a 7-day free trial and start streaming over 100 hours of exclusive video content on consciousness, healing, and life after death. That's path11tv.com, and be sure to use coupon code podcast30 to take 30% off your annual membership. Start satisfying your spiritual curiosity with a membership to Path 11 TV today. Bye for now.